In the forests of France, 1944, an entire platoon of American soldiers disappears in plain sight. German reconnaissance passes within 20 feet and sees nothing but trees and bushes. No movement, no shapes, no soldiers. This wasn't magic. It was science. The science of staying invisible when your life depends on it. During World War II, camouflage evolved from simple green paint to an art form that could make a man vanish completely. Soldiers learned tricks that went far beyond uniform patterns. They studied light, shadow, movement, and human psychology to become ghosts on the battlefield. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In occupied Europe, being spotted meant death or capture. No second chances. No do-overs. The difference between invisible and almost invisible was the difference between going home and never seeing your family again. Traditional military thinking focused on firepower and movement. But as the war progressed, something became clear. The soldiers who survived longest weren't always the best shots or the fastest runners. They were the ones who could disappear when they needed to. The ones who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon was the ability to not be seen at all. This realization changed everything about how infantry operated. Suddenly, every leaf, every shadow, every patch of dirt became a potential lifesaver. Soldiers began studying their environment like scientists, learning the subtle differences between natural and unnatural patterns, understanding how human eyes tracked movement and identified threats. The German Wehrmacht had their own specialists, trained observers who could spot the smallest inconsistencies in terrain. Men who had hunted game before the war and brought those same skills to hunting humans. They knew what to look for. The slight difference in texture that meant fabric instead of bark. The geometric shape that nature never makes. The reflection that came from metal instead of water. Allied forces responded by developing counter techniques. Not just better camouflage uniforms, but entire systems of concealment that took into account wind patterns, lighting conditions, even the time of day and season. They learned that hiding wasn't passive. It was an active skill that required constant adjustment and awareness. The British formed special units dedicated to studying camouflage. They brought in artists, naturalists, and stage magicians to understand the psychology of deception. What makes the human eye notice something? What makes it overlook what's right in front of it? These weren't academic questions. The answers would determine who lived and who died. American forces took a different approach, focusing on practical field techniques that ordinary soldiers could learn quickly. No elaborate equipment. No special training schools. Just battlefield-tested methods that worked in real combat conditions. Methods that could be taught in a few hours and mastered through practice. The Pacific Theater added another dimension. Jungle warfare meant different rules entirely. Camouflage that worked in European forests failed completely in tropical environments. Soldiers had to learn new techniques for different vegetation, different lighting, different enemy tactics. Japanese forces were masters of jungle concealment, forcing Allied troops to develop entirely new approaches to staying hidden. But it was on the Eastern Front where camouflage became most critical. The vast open spaces of Russia offered little natural cover. Soviet and German forces engaged in a deadly game of hide and seek across terrain that seemed to offer no hiding places at all. Here, soldiers learned that concealment wasn't about finding the perfect hiding spot. It was about creating one where none existed. Winter warfare presented unique challenges. Snow changed everything about visibility and movement. What worked in summer could get you killed in winter. Soldiers learned to read snow conditions like a survival manual. Fresh snow versus old snow. Wind-blown versus undisturbed. The angle of sunlight on white surfaces that could reveal or conceal. Urban warfare brought yet another set of rules. Cities destroyed by bombing created landscapes of rubble and shadows that changed daily. Soldiers learned to use destruction as concealment, understanding how to move through ruins without creating the dust clouds or debris slides that would reveal their position. The most successful soldiers developed what military trainers called ground sense, an intuitive understanding of terrain and concealment that went beyond any manual or training course. They could look at any environment and immediately see the hiding places, the danger zones, the paths that offered concealment. This wasn't just about individual survival. Entire military operations depended on the ability to move troops undetected. The D-Day landing succeeded partly because Allied forces had mastered the art of concealing massive military buildups. Thousands of men and vehicles hidden in plain sight across southern England. The techniques that emerged from World War II weren't theoretical exercises. They were practical solutions developed under extreme pressure by men whose lives depended on getting them right. Every trick, every method, every technique was paid for in blood and tested in conditions where failure meant death. In this video, we'll uncover 7 specific camouflage techniques that Allied and Axis forces used to fool enemy scouts time and time again. These weren't just clever ideas. They were battle-tested methods that saved thousands of lives and changed the outcome of entire operations. Methods so effective that they remained classified for decades after the war ended. Techniques that turned ordinary soldiers into invisible warriors who could operate behind enemy lines for weeks without detection. The war may have ended in 1945, but the lessons learned about human concealment continue to influence military training today. Because in the end, the most advanced technology in the world still depends on the human beings who operate it. And sometimes, the most important skill those human beings can possess is the ability to become invisible when their mission depends on it. The first lesson every scout learned was simple but counterintuitive. Never hide in your own shadow. This mistake killed more inexperienced soldiers than almost any other camouflage error. When sunlight hits your body, it creates a distinct shadow with sharp edges and unnatural density. Even when you think you're perfectly concealed behind cover, that shadow extends beyond your hiding place like a pointing finger telling enemy observers exactly where you are. Instead, experienced soldiers always position themselves within existing shadows cast by trees, rocks, buildings, or terrain features. Natural shadows have soft edges and vary in density. They move slightly with the wind as branches sway or clouds pass overhead. By placing yourself within these natural shadow patterns, you eliminate the telltale outline that trained eyes can spot from hundreds of yards away. The technique required understanding how shadows changed throughout the day. A position that offered perfect concealment at dawn could become a death trap by noon when the sun moved overhead. Soldiers learned to read the angle of sunlight like a clock, predicting where shadows would fall hours in advance. They planned movement routes that kept them in shadow zones, sometimes taking much longer paths to avoid crossing areas of bright sunlight. German snipers became particularly skilled at using shadow patterns to their advantage. They would study a target area for hours, noting how shadows shifted, where they remained consistent, and which positions offered the longest periods of concealment. Soviet counter-snipers responded by learning to spot the subtle differences between natural shadows and shadows that concealed human shapes. The second critical technique involved breaking the human silhouette. The human form has a recognizable shape that stands out dramatically in any natural environment. Shoulders create a distinctive horizontal line that nature rarely produces. The head forms a perfect sphere or oval that simply doesn't exist in wild terrain. The way humans stand, with weight distributed on 2 legs, creates proportions that the human eye has evolved to recognize instantly. German snipers called this the mannequin effect. Even with good camouflage uniforms, a human shape remained recognizably human from significant distances. The solution wasn't better fabric patterns. It was completely altering the apparent shape of the human body. Soldiers learned to break up their outline using vegetation, debris, or natural materials found in their immediate environment. This went far beyond simply sticking a few leaves in a helmet. It required matching the exact type of foliage found in their specific hiding location. Oak leaves in oak forests, pine boughs in pine areas, grass bundles in meadows, fern fronds in forest undergrowth. The wrong vegetation was actually worse than no camouflage at all. A pine branch attached to equipment in a deciduous forest immediately identified the position as artificial. Enemy scouts were trained to look for exactly these kinds of inconsistencies. They knew that nature didn't mix vegetation types randomly, and anything that violated natural patterns deserved closer investigation. British commandos developed sophisticated techniques for vegetation camouflage that took into account seasonal changes, weather conditions, and even the time of day. Fresh vegetation looked different from vegetation that had been cut hours earlier. Leaves changed color and texture as they dried. Experienced soldiers replaced their vegetation camouflage every few hours to maintain the illusion of natural growth. The third technique focused on movement discipline, but not in the way most people understand it. Complete stillness wasn't the answer. Absolute motionlessness actually made soldiers more visible in certain conditions because it created an unnatural dead zone in environments where everything else moved slightly with wind, insects, or small animals. The key was moving like nature moves. Slow, irregular, matching the rhythm of wind through grass or leaves settling on branches. Quick, jerky movements triggered the hunter instinct in enemy scouts. The human brain is hardwired to detect rapid movement, especially movement that doesn't match natural patterns. But fluid, natural motion could happen right in front of observers without triggering their attention. Japanese forces in the Pacific became masters of natural movement. They could advance through jungle vegetation so slowly and smoothly that Allied sentries would stare directly at them without recognizing human shapes. The technique required extraordinary patience and body control. Soldiers practiced for hours, learning to move individual limbs in ways that mimicked wind patterns or animal movement. Soviet snipers developed similar techniques for urban environments. In bombed cities, debris shifted constantly with wind, settling buildings and small animals. A skilled sniper could move through rubble fields by matching these natural movement patterns, advancing position by position over the course of hours without being detected. The fourth technique addressed one of the most overlooked aspects of camouflage. Human skin, especially faces and hands, reflects light differently than anything found in nature. Even in deep shadow, pale skin could glow like a beacon to trained observers using binoculars or telescopic sights. The contrast between skin tone and natural colors created an immediate recognition signal that no amount of uniform camouflage could overcome. Soldiers learned to create face paint using locally available materials. Not random smearing, but carefully planned patterns that matched their specific environment. Horizontal stripes for hiding in tall grass, because grass creates horizontal shadow lines. Irregular blotches for rocky terrain, matching the random patterns of stone and shadow. Dark colors under the eyes and nose, lighter colors on prominent features to flatten the face's natural contours and eliminate the three-dimensional shadows that made faces recognizable from distance. The mixture of materials mattered as much as the pattern. Dirt from the immediate area provided the right color match, but pure dirt cracked and flaked off. Charcoal added darker tones and helped the mixture adhere better. Grease or animal fat, when available, created longer-lasting coverage that wouldn't wash off in rain or heavy sweating. Different environments required different approaches to face camouflage. Desert operations needed lighter, sandy colors that matched the bleached appearance of sun-baked terrain. Forest operations required darker, earthier tones that matched the rich colors of soil and decomposing vegetation. Urban warfare called for gray and black patterns that mimicked concrete, ash, and shadow. The fifth technique focused on equipment modification, addressing one of the most dangerous oversight issues in field camouflage. Metal equipment was a dead giveaway that could compromise an entire position from hundreds of yards away. Rifle barrels, buckles, buttons, watches, even the metal grommets on boots could catch and reflect light like mirrors, creating bright flashes that were visible for miles in the right conditions. Enemy scouts were specifically trained to watch for these light reflections, called scope glint, when it came from telescopic sights. German observation posts used powerful binoculars to scan Allied positions, looking for the telltale flash of reflected sunlight that indicated sniper positions or observation posts. A single moment of carelessness with reflective equipment could result in immediate artillery bombardment or sniper fire. Soldiers learned to dull every metallic surface using mud, charcoal, or specially issued non-reflective paint. But the technique went beyond simple coating. It required understanding how light behaved in different conditions and which angles created the most dangerous reflections. A rifle barrel that was perfectly concealed when pointing in one direction could become a blazing beacon when rotated even a few degrees. Snipers developed the most sophisticated equipment modification techniques. They wrapped their rifle scopes in cloth strips that matched local vegetation patterns, leaving only tiny viewing holes that prevented scope glint while maintaining visibility. Barrel covers used burlap or canvas painted in irregular patterns that broke up the long, straight lines that made rifles recognizable from distance. The technique extended to personal equipment. Soldiers learned to cover or remove anything that could reflect light. Wristwatches were worn face down or covered with fabric. Belt buckles were painted or covered. Even brass buttons were replaced with wooden ones when possible, or painted with dark, non-reflective coatings. Weather conditions affected equipment camouflage dramatically. Rain could wash off protective coatings, while humidity caused some paints to streak or run. Snow operations required different approaches entirely, as equipment that was invisible against green vegetation became starkly visible against white backgrounds. Soldiers carried multiple camouflage materials to adapt their equipment to changing conditions. The sixth technique addressed an often overlooked aspect of concealment: sound discipline. Experienced enemy scouts could locate hidden positions by sound alone, especially at night when visual identification became difficult. The human ear could detect and locate sounds that were completely outside the range of normal conversation, and soldiers learned that what they couldn't see could still kill them. Every piece of equipment created distinctive sounds that didn't belong in natural environments. The clink of metal on metal when ammunition shifted in pouches. The rustle of synthetic fabric that sounded different from wind through natural vegetation. The squeak of leather that had gotten wet and dried repeatedly. The distinctive sound of human breathing, especially in cold weather when breath created visible vapor clouds. Soldiers learned to identify and eliminate these unnatural sounds through equipment modification and movement techniques. They stuffed cloth between metal parts to prevent contact. They oiled leather regularly to eliminate squeaking. They even changed how they breathed, using slower, deeper breathing patterns that reduced the fog of warm breath in cold air and minimized the sound of air movement. The technique required understanding how sound traveled in different environments. Forests with dense vegetation absorbed most sounds, allowing soldiers to move with less sound discipline. Open terrain, especially at night, carried sound for enormous distances. Snow amplified certain sounds while muffling others, creating acoustic conditions that changed the rules of sound camouflage completely. Urban environments presented unique sound challenges. The hard surfaces of buildings created echoes that could reveal positions even when the original sound was carefully muffled. Soldiers learned to use ambient noise from wind, traffic, or artillery bombardment to mask their movement sounds, timing any necessary noise to coincide with louder environmental sounds. The seventh and most advanced technique was misdirection through decoy positions. This psychological approach to camouflage recognized that human observers were pattern recognition machines that could be fooled by presenting them with what they expected to see while hiding the real threat in an unexpected location. The technique worked by creating obvious but false positions that drew enemy attention while operating from completely concealed locations nearby. Enemy scouts were trained to look for camouflage positions, and they were very good at spotting them. The trick was to give them something to find while keeping the real position completely hidden. Snipers became masters of this technique. They would set up elaborate fake positions complete with dummy rifle barrels made from painted sticks, false muzzle flashes created with mirrors or reflective material, and even fake scope glint timed to coincide with enemy observation periods. Meanwhile, the Real sniper operated from a position that was often in plain sight, but disguised as something completely different. The technique required understanding enemy psychology and observation patterns. German scouts followed predictable search patterns when looking for sniper positions. They looked for elevated positions with good fields of fire, positions that offered concealment and escape routes, and positions that showed signs of recent occupation. By creating false positions that met all these criteria, Allied snipers could draw attention away from their actual firing positions. Decoy positions had to be maintained and updated to remain convincing. Static decoys were quickly identified as false. Successful decoys included movement, apparent occupation, and realistic details that would hold up under telescopic observation. Some elaborate decoys included heating elements to create heat signatures that would fool infrared detection equipment when it became available later in the war. These camouflage techniques came together in one of the most desperate situations of the entire European campaign. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, British paratroopers found themselves cut off and surrounded near Arnhem Bridge in the Netherlands. What was supposed to be a quick operation to secure the bridge had turned into a nightmare of urban warfare against overwhelming German forces. The paratroopers were trapped in a bombed-out city with no hope of immediate rescue. German forces knew exactly where they were, but the question was finding them among the rubble and ruins. For the British soldiers, camouflage wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the difference between survival and capture or death. They used every technique they had learned, adapting them to an urban environment that changed daily as artillery bombardment created new hiding places and eliminated others. The soldiers broke their silhouettes using rubble and debris from bombed buildings, carefully selecting materials that matched the color and texture of their surroundings. A piece of concrete that was the wrong shade of gray could give away a position just as easily as a bright green leaf in a desert. Faces were blackened with soot from the numerous fires burning throughout the city. This wasn't just random smearing. The soldiers used the soot to create shadow patterns that matched the harsh lighting conditions created by fires and reflected light from white concrete dust. The urban environment created unique lighting that was completely different from forest or field conditions. Equipment was dulled with mud and ash that was readily available throughout the bombed city. But more importantly, the soldiers learned to use the acoustic properties of urban ruins to their advantage. They moved only when German vehicles passed nearby, using engine noise to mask any sound of movement through debris fields. The technique of decoy positions became critical in the urban environment. The British soldiers used empty helmets on sticks to draw German attention to false positions while real soldiers observed from basement windows and bombed-out buildings across the street. The Germans could see obvious signs of British presence, but they couldn't pinpoint exact locations. One particularly effective technique involved using the thermal properties of bombed buildings. Soldiers learned that basement positions remained cooler during the day and warmer at night than surface positions. By timing their movements to take advantage of these temperature differences, they could avoid creating heat signatures that differed from their surroundings. The water and electrical systems of the city had been destroyed, creating flooding in some areas and electrical fires in others. The paratroopers learned to use these hazards as concealment. Flooded basements that seemed impassable actually provided excellent hiding places for soldiers willing to wade through contaminated water. Electrical fires created smoke screens that concealed movement while also providing acoustic cover. For 72 hours, small groups of paratroopers remained effectively invisible in a city that was actively being searched by enemy troops with dogs, vehicles, and air support. The Germans knew British soldiers were in the area. Intelligence reports gave them accurate numbers and general locations, but they couldn't find them. When rescue finally came, many German soldiers were shocked to learn how close they had been to their targets without ever seeing them. British positions were discovered in buildings that German patrols had searched multiple times. Some soldiers had been hiding within 20 feet of German command posts for days without being detected. The success of these concealment techniques under such extreme conditions proved that camouflage was far more than just wearing the right uniform or painting your face green. It was a comprehensive system of deception that took into account human psychology, environmental conditions, and enemy behavior patterns. But the real lesson of Arnhem went beyond tactical success. These camouflage techniques worked because they understood a fundamental truth about human observation that remains relevant today. We see what we expect to see, and we miss what doesn't fit our mental patterns. The human brain processes visual information by comparing what it sees to stored patterns of familiar objects and situations. Enemy scouts weren't looking for perfect invisibility, which would have been impossible to achieve. They were looking for things that seemed out of place. A shadow where no shadow should be according to the light source. Movement that didn't match the rhythm of wind or natural environmental motion. Light reflecting from surfaces that shouldn't reflect light in that particular environment. The soldiers who survived these impossible situations weren't necessarily the best marksmen or the fastest runners. Often, they were the ones who had learned to become part of the landscape so completely that trained enemy observers could look directly at them without recognizing human shapes. They had mastered the art of becoming something else entirely. World War II camouflage represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about concealment. It wasn't about disappearing entirely, which was impossible in most combat situations. It was about becoming something that belonged in the environment, something that fit the natural patterns well enough that the human brain would categorize it as background rather than threat. The psychological aspect was just as important as the physical techniques. Soldiers learned to think like their environment, to understand what belonged and what seemed artificial. They studied the subtle differences between natural randomness and human-created patterns. They learned that nature very rarely created straight lines, perfect symmetry, or geometric shapes. Most importantly, they learned that effective camouflage required constant adaptation. Techniques that worked in one environment failed completely in another. Methods that were effective in summer became useless in winter. Urban camouflage required completely different approaches from forest concealment. The legacy of these World War II camouflage techniques extends far beyond military applications. The principles of blending into environments, understanding human pattern recognition, and using misdirection to avoid detection have influenced everything from wildlife photography to architectural design. In a war where being seen meant being killed, these 7 techniques turned ordinary soldiers into ghosts who could operate behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and complete missions that seemed impossible. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't firepower or technology. Sometimes it was simply the ability to become invisible when survival depended on it. And in the end, that ability to disappear when death was looking for you was often the only thing that brought soldiers home alive.